He thought removing her would protect the ceremony, but he had no idea he was about to silence an entire room without saying a single word. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Evelyn Carter. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Westbridge High School's auditorium, casting long golden beams across rows of neatly arranged chairs filled with proud parents, polished shoes, and quiet anticipation. It was graduation day, the kind of day where every detail mattered, where every name called carried years of sacrifice behind it. On stage, Principal Daniel Brooks stood tall in his tailored navy suit, his voice steady, his posture rehearsed, embodying authority in a room that trusted him to uphold both order and excellence. But near the very back of the auditorium, just beyond the last row of reserved seating, stood a woman who seemed to exist outside that polished world. Evelyn Carter held a worn ivory envelope close to her chest, her fingers resting gently along its edges as if it carried something fragile, something irreplaceable. Her light gray cardigan hung loosely over a simple blouse, her shoes practical, slightly scuffed, the kind of details that didn't belong in a room filled with pressed suits and designer dresses. She didn't speak. She didn't move much. She simply watched. And yet, there was something about her stillness that didn't quite match the assumptions people were already making. Principal Brooks noticed her almost immediately. Years of running ceremonies had sharpened his eye for anything out of place, and Evelyn stood out not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, his brow tightening ever so slightly as he leaned toward one of the staff members near the stage. A quiet exchange followed. Subtle, controlled, but deliberate. The ceremony continued, names being called, applause rising and falling in waves, cameras flashing as families captured moments they had waited years to witness. Yet Brooks' attention kept drifting back to the woman in gray. Something about her presence disrupted the symmetry he had worked so hard to maintain. And in his world, anything that disrupted order needed to be addressed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, one of the security staff made their way down the aisle. Their footsteps were soft against the polished floor, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. Evelyn noticed them approaching, her eyes lifting calmly, her expression unchanged. No panic, no confusion, just quiet awareness. "Ma'am," the guard said in a low voice, leaning slightly closer. "This section is reserved. I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." A few nearby parents turned their heads, curiosity flickering across their faces. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply glanced once toward the stage, toward the rows of students in their caps and gowns, and then back at the guard. For a brief moment, her grip on the envelope tightened. Then, without a word, she nodded. The room continued as if nothing had happened. Applause rose again as another name was called. But beneath the surface, something subtle had shifted. A few more eyes followed her as she began to walk down the aisle, her steps measured, unhurried, almost as if she had expected this moment long before it arrived. Principal Brooks watched from the stage, satisfied, his posture relaxing slightly as the disruption was quietly removed. Order restored. Or so he believed. Because what he couldn't see, what no one in that room could yet understand, was that Evelyn Carter hadn't come to disrupt the ceremony. She had come to change it. And as the auditorium lights shimmered softly against polished marble floors, something unspoken lingered in the air, like the faint pause before a storm no one saw coming. The room carried on, unaware that within minutes, everything they thought they understood about belonging, status, and respect was about to be rewritten in complete and utter silence. Outside the auditorium doors, the air felt different, quieter, almost detached from the celebration happening just a few feet away. Evelyn Carter stepped into the long marble corridor, the echo of applause muffled behind the heavy wooden doors as they closed slowly behind her. For a moment, she stood still, her reflection faintly visible in the polished glass panels lining the hallway. The envelope remained in her hands, its edges slightly worn, its surface marked by time rather than neglect. She looked down at it briefly, her fingers brushing across the corner as if tracing a memory rather than holding paper. Inside the auditorium, Principal Daniel Brooks continued the ceremony with practiced precision, calling names, shaking hands, maintaining the rhythm he had perfected over the years. To him, the interruption had already faded into insignificance, just another minor correction in a day that demanded perfection. But not everyone had forgotten. Near the center rows, a young graduate shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting toward the doors where Evelyn had just exited. His name was Marcus Carter, and though he sat among his classmates in a neatly pressed navy gown, his focus had drifted far from the stage. His fingers tightened slightly around the program in his lap, the printed names blurring as a quiet tension settled in his chest. He had seen everything, every word, every glance, every assumption, and more importantly, he knew something no one else in that room did. Back in the hallway, a school staff member approached Evelyn with a polite but firm smile, the kind that carried authority wrapped in courtesy. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to wait outside the building," she said, her tone measured, rehearsed, careful not to escalate what she believed was a simple misunderstanding. Evelyn lifted her gaze slowly, her eyes calm, steady, unshaken by the request. There was no frustration in her expression, no urgency to defend herself. Instead, there was something far more unsettling in its quietness, a certainty that did not need to announce itself. "I understand," she replied softly. Her voice carried no resistance, only acknowledgement. The staff member nodded, satisfied, already turning her attention back toward the ceremony, as if the situation had been resolved. But Evelyn did not move immediately. Instead, she turned, slightly, her eyes drifting toward a framed photograph hanging along the hallway wall. It showed a graduating class from years earlier, rows of smiling faces frozen in time beneath the same school crest that now decorated the auditorium stage. Her gaze lingered there for a moment longer than expected, something reflective passing through her expression, something personal. Then, quietly, she stepped toward the exit. Outside, the parking lot stretched under the fading afternoon light. Rows of cars lined neatly across freshly painted spaces. Families moved about in small clusters, some arriving late, others waiting for the ceremony to end. The distant hum of conversation blended with the occasional laughter, creating a contrast to the silence that seemed to follow Evelyn as she walked. She stopped near the edge of the walkway, just before the main steps leading down to the lot. Again, she did not rush. Again, she did not react the way anyone might expect. Instead, she simply stood there, the envelope still in her hands, her posture composed, her presence almost invisible to those passing by. Inside the auditorium, Marcus could no longer sit still. His heart pounded louder than the applause, louder than the speeches, louder than the carefully controlled environment surrounding him. He glanced toward the stage, toward Principal Brooks, and for a brief moment, something shifted behind his eyes. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something deeper, something that had been building quietly for years. And as another name echoed through the microphone, Marcus made a decision. The kind of decision that changes not just a moment, but everything that follows it. The room continued, unaware, orderly, structured, controlled. But beneath that order, something had already begun to fracture. And just beyond those doors, standing alone under the soft glow of the evening sun, Evelyn Carter waited, not for permission, not for recognition, but for the exact moment when silence would say more than any words ever could. Marcus Carter rose from his seat before he fully realized he was standing, the fabric of his graduation gown brushing softly against the chair as the movement drew a few quiet glances from nearby students. His name had not yet been called, but something more urgent had taken hold of him, something that would not wait for ceremony or permission. On stage, Principal Daniel Brooks continued speaking, his voice steady through the microphone, unaware that the carefully controlled rhythm of the event was beginning to shift in ways he could not yet see. Marcus stepped into the aisle, his heartbeat loud in his ears, his eyes fixed on the stage, as if measuring the distance between what was happening and what needed to happen. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, not because of doubt, but because of the weight of truth pressing against silence. A teacher seated near the front noticed him first, her expression tightening slightly as she leaned toward a colleague, whispering something that carried the familiar tone of concern for disruption. But Marcus did not stop. He kept walking, past rows of families holding cameras, past classmates waiting for their names, past the invisible line that separated audience from authority. "Excuse me," he said when he reached the base of the stage, his voice respectful but firm, just loud enough to cut through the ceremony without shattering it. Principal Brooks paused mid-sentence, his eyes lowering toward the unexpected interruption. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by a controlled smile, the kind he used when managing situations he believed he understood. "Please return to your seat," Brooks said calmly, leaning slightly toward the microphone, his tone measured, maintaining composure for the room that watched him. Marcus did not move. "Sir," he continued, his voice steadier now, "you asked someone to leave who should not have been asked to leave." A subtle ripple moved through the audience, not loud, not chaotic, but noticeable enough to fracture the polished stillness that had defined the ceremony until now. Brooks' smile tightened, his posture straightening as he adjusted his stance behind the podium. "This is not the time for personal matters," he replied, his voice still controlled, but carrying a sharper edge beneath its surface. "Please take your seat so we can continue." Marcus' gaze did not waver. "Her name is Evelyn Carter," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable placed with care. "And she belongs here more than anyone in this room." The air shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Conversations paused. Programs lowered. A few heads turned more fully now, curiosity beginning to replace indifference. On stage, Brooks' expression flickered for the briefest moment, something uncertain passing through his eyes before discipline pulled it back into place. "Young man," he said, his tone firmer now, "you are disrupting an important event. I will ask you one last time to return to your seat." Marcus took a small step forward instead. Not aggressive, not defiant, just undeniable. "She is my mother," he said quietly. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they needed to, carried not by volume, but by truth. A hush followed, not complete, not yet, but growing. Brooks inhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the podium. "That does not change the protocol," he replied, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. "All guests are required to follow seating guidelines." Marcus nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "Then maybe the protocol is wrong," he said, his tone still respectful, but now carrying something deeper, something grounded, something that did not bend easily. From the side of the stage, one of the administrators stepped closer, uncertainty visible in the way he hesitated before speaking. "Daniel," he said quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "we might want to verify." Brooks raised a hand slightly, stopping him before the sentence could finish. Control, order, structure. Those were the things he trusted. Those were the things he believed in. But in that moment, standing under the bright stage lights with a room full of watching eyes, something unfamiliar began to settle in. Doubt. Not loud, not obvious, but present. And outside, beyond the closed doors, Evelyn Carter remained where she had stopped, the evening light soft against her shoulders, the envelope still held gently in her hands. She did not move. She did not rush. Because somewhere deep beneath the surface of everything unfolding inside that auditorium, she already knew something they did not. The moment they tried to remove her was the moment they lost control of everything that came next. And inside that room, the silence was beginning to take shape. The air inside the auditorium changed in a way that no one could quite explain, as if the room itself had begun to listen more carefully. Principal Daniel Brooks remained still behind the podium, his hand resting lightly on its edge, his posture still composed but no longer effortless. The confidence that had once filled his voice now moved more cautiously, as though each word required consideration rather than instinct. Marcus Carter stood at the base of the stage, his presence no longer a disruption but something else entirely, something that refused to be dismissed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the far side of the stage, the event coordinator leaned toward the microphone stand, her expression tense but controlled. "We have a scheduled recognition segment," she said softly, glancing toward Brooks as if offering him a path forward. "Perhaps we should proceed." Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before nodding. It was a small decision, but one that would quietly shift everything. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat slightly. "Let us continue." He adjusted the stack of cards in front of him, his eyes scanning the next portion of the program. Before we conclude, we would like to recognize a special contributor whose support has made this year's scholarship program possible. The words were familiar, routine even, but something in the way they were delivered felt different now, heavier, as though the meaning behind them had suddenly gained weight. In the audience, a few heads tilted, curiosity replacing impatience. Marcus did not move. He remained exactly where he stood, his gaze fixed on Brooks, waiting. This individual, Brooks continued, his voice steady but slower now, has chosen to remain anonymous for many years, believing that opportunity should speak louder than recognition. A murmur passed through the crowd, quiet but growing. Anonymous donors were not unusual, but the timing of this announcement, coming directly after the interruption, began to connect threads that no one had yet fully understood. Brooks glanced down at the card in his hand, his fingers tightening slightly as his eyes moved across the printed name. For a moment, he did not speak. The silence stretched, thin at first, then heavier, as if the room itself sensed what was about to unfold. "This scholarship," he said finally, his voice no longer carrying the same certainty as before, "has supported over 100 students in the past decade." A soft ripple of applause began, polite, expected. But Brooks did not continue. His eyes remained fixed on the name in front of him, and something in his expression shifted again, more visibly this time. Confusion, recognition, and then something else. Understanding. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted his gaze from the card and looked out toward the audience, his eyes scanning the rows as if searching for something he had previously overlooked. His voice, when it came again, was quieter. "The founder of this program," he paused, the words catching slightly, "is Evelyn Carter." The room stilled. Not immediately, not all at once, but in a wave that moved from one row to the next, as if the name itself carried a realization that needed time to settle. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in confirmation. It had begun. On stage, Brooks remained frozen for a fraction longer than he intended, the weight of the moment pressing against the structure he had relied on for years. "We would like to invite her to the stage," he added, though the words now felt incomplete, insufficient. A staff member near the side of the auditorium hesitated, glancing toward the doors, then back to Brooks, uncertainty clear in every movement. Because everyone in that room now understood something he had not yet fully faced. The person he had asked to leave was the very reason this ceremony existed as it did. Outside, Evelyn Carter stood exactly where she had been, the soft evening light now fading into a cooler tone as the sun dipped lower. In the sky, she did not hear the exact words spoken inside, but she did not need to. The shift had already reached her in a different way, carried not by sound, but by the quiet certainty that the truth, once delayed, had finally arrived. And inside that auditorium, as eyes slowly turned toward the door she had walked through, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with realization. For a moment, no one moved. The name lingered in the air like something fragile, something that could not be taken back once spoken. Evelyn Carter. It was no longer just a name. It was a realization unfolding in real time, one that moved quietly from one person to the next, reshaping the meaning of everything that had happened just minutes before. Principal Daniel Brooks stood frozen behind the podium, the card still held between his fingers, but now it felt heavier than paper ever should. His eyes shifted toward the auditorium doors, the same doors through which he had been asked to leave, and for the first time that day, he did not look in control. A staff member hurried down the aisle, her steps quicker than before, her expression no longer composed but urgent, as she reached the doors and pushed them open. Outside, the evening air had cooled, and the golden light had softened into a quiet blue. Evelyn Carter still stood near the steps, exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady as if time had not touched her at all. The staff member paused when she saw her, the weight of what she now understood slowing her movement. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice softer than before, almost careful, "they are asking for you inside." Evelyn looked at her for a brief moment, her expression calm, unreadable, and then she gave a small nod. No hesitation, no surprise, as if this moment had always been part of the path. She turned and walked back toward the doors, her steps measured, quiet, each one carrying a presence that had gone unnoticed before but could no longer be ignored. Inside the auditorium, the silence deepened as the doors opened again. Heads turned instantly, not out of curiosity now, but recognition. Conversations stopped. Programs lowered. Even the faint movements of shifting seats seemed to disappear. Evelyn Carter stepped inside, her figure framed by the soft light from the hallway behind her. She did not rush. She did not look around in search of approval. She simply walked forward, her eyes steady, her hands still holding the envelope that had never left her side. Marcus watched her from where he stood, his chest rising slowly as something settled within him, something that had been building long before this day. On stage, Principal Brooks straightened, but the motion lacked its earlier certainty. When Evelyn reached the front of the auditorium, she paused just briefly, not because she needed to, but because the moment itself seemed to ask for it. Then she stepped toward the stage. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The room did not need instruction anymore. It had already understood. Brooks stepped back slightly, creating space without being asked, his gaze lowering for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to meet hers. But even then, something had changed. The authority he once carried so effortlessly now felt misplaced, as though it had shifted to someone else without warning. Evelyn accepted the microphone when it was offered, her fingers brushing lightly against it, her posture composed, her presence quiet but undeniable. She looked out at the room, at the rows of faces that had once overlooked her, and for a brief moment, the silence held completely. Not empty, not awkward, but full. Then she spoke, her voice gentle, steady, carrying farther than anyone expected. "This ceremony," she said, "is not about who looks like they belong." She paused, not for effect, but because the truth itself needed space to settle. It is about who shows up, who endures, and who believes in something greater than themselves. No applause followed. Not immediately, because the room was still catching up to the weight of what had just been revealed. Evelyn lowered the microphone slightly, her eyes calm, her expression unchanged. And in that moment, the silence said everything that words no longer needed to. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding something too heavy for too long. Evelyn Carter stood at the center of it, not as someone who had taken control, but as someone who had never needed to fight for it in the first place. Her presence did not demand attention, it redefined it. Around her, the auditorium remained still, rows of faces no longer filled with quiet judgment, but with something deeper, something closer to reflection. Principal Daniel Brooks remained a step behind her, his posture straight but no longer commanding, his expression composed but undeniably altered. The structure he had trusted, the certainty he had relied on, had not collapsed loudly. It had simply faded, replaced by a truth he could not redirect. Evelyn lowered the microphone slightly, her gaze moving across the room, not searching, not measuring, but seeing. Truly seeing. "For years," she continued, her voice steady, carrying without effort, "this program has helped students who were told they were not enough, not ready, not the right fit." A few students in the audience shifted, their eyes lowering briefly as if recognizing something personal in those words. "And every year," she said, "I chose not to stand on this stage, because the purpose was never about recognition." She paused, her fingers resting lightly against the microphone, her posture unchanged. It was about giving someone else the chance to stand here instead. The words settled into the room with quiet weight. No dramatic reaction, no sudden applause, just a growing understanding that moved from one person to another. Marcus remained near the front, his eyes fixed on his mother, not with surprise, but with something closer to respect that had been waiting for this moment to be seen. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his for a brief second, and in that exchange, there was no need for explanation. Only acknowledgement. Then she looked back toward the audience. "But today," she continued, "something important happened." Her voice did not rise, but it carried further. Someone was asked to leave before anyone asked who she was. A subtle shift moved through the room, not discomfort, not resistance, but recognition. That could no longer be ignored. Brooks' jaw tightened slightly, his gaze lowering for the briefest moment before he forced himself to remain still. Evelyn did not look at him. She did not need to. And that is why I am standing here now, she said. Because respect should not depend on appearance, position, or assumption. The room held her words carefully, as if afraid to interrupt what was still unfolding. It should be given first, she added softly, not earned after damage has already been done. The silence that followed was different now. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of understanding, of reflection, of something quietly shifting in the way people saw not just her, but themselves. Evelyn stepped back slightly from the microphone, her role in the moment already complete, not because she had finished speaking, but because she had said exactly what needed to be said. Principal Brooks moved forward again, but the motion felt smaller now, as though the space itself had changed its expectations of him. He cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone, but the words he had prepared earlier no longer fit the moment. They belonged to a version of the ceremony that no longer existed. "Ms. Carter," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, the confidence replaced by something more careful. "On behalf of Westbridge High School," he paused, the sentence faltering slightly. Not from lack of preparation, but from the realization that formality alone could not restore what had been lost. Evelyn turned her head slightly toward him, her expression calm, not dismissive, not forgiving, simply present. And in that moment, the entire room understood something without needing it explained. Authority can speak, titles can command, but dignity, once revealed, does not need either. The auditorium remained still, not because it was waiting for the ceremony to continue, but because it had already reached something more important than any scripted ending. And in that stillness, something quiet but permanent took root, the kind of lesson that does not fade when the lights go out or the chairs are folded away. The kind that stays, long after the moment has passed. The moment did not end when Evelyn Carter stepped back from the microphone. It deepened, stretching across the room in a way that made every person present aware that they were part of something that could not simply be dismissed or forgotten. Principal Daniel Brooks stood beside her, the distance between them small in space but immense in meaning. He adjusted his posture again, but this time it was not to regain control. It was to find balance in a situation that no longer followed his direction. The audience remained quiet, not out of obligation, but because no one wanted to be the first to interrupt what had just been revealed. Brooks looked out across the room, his eyes moving slowly, taking in the faces that no longer reflected blind trust, but something more thoughtful, more aware. He understood now, though he had not planned to, that this was no longer about continuing the ceremony. It was about acknowledging what had happened within it. He inhaled, steadying himself, and then spoke again, his voice lower, stripped of the confident projection it once carried. "There are moments," he began, choosing each word carefully, "when a mistake is not just procedural." He paused, the weight of the admission settling even before he finished the thought. "It is human." The room did not react outwardly, but something shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Evelyn remained still, her expression unchanged, not interrupting, not encouraging, simply allowing the truth to take its own form. Brooks turned slightly toward her, not fully, not yet, but enough to acknowledge her presence directly rather than as part of the audience. "Ms. Carter," he said, the formality now carrying a different tone, one of recognition rather than distance. "What happened earlier should not have happened." There was no attempt to explain, no attempt to soften it with justification. Just a statement. Clean, direct, and late. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Evelyn met his gaze briefly, her eyes steady, not cold, not warm, simply clear. "No," she replied quietly, her voice calm. "It should not have." She did not raise her voice. She did not extend the moment. She simply confirmed it. And somehow, that made it heavier than any long speech could have. Brooks nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more meaning than anything he had said before. He turned back toward the audience, his shoulders no longer squared in authority, but relaxed in a way that suggested something had been let go. "We will continue," he said, though even he understood that the ceremony had already changed in a way that could not be reversed. He glanced toward the list of names, the familiar sequence waiting for him, but now each name felt different, each student no longer just part of a program, but part of something larger, something more personal. "Marcus Carter," he called. The name carried across the auditorium with a clarity that seemed sharper than before. Marcus stepped forward, his movement steady, his eyes briefly meeting his mother's as he passed. There was no dramatic exchange, no visible emotion, just a quiet understanding between them that needed no audience. When he reached the stage, Brooks extended his hand, but there was a slight hesitation this time, not uncertainty, but awareness. Marcus accepted the handshake, firm, respectful, but grounded in something deeper than formality. Brooks handed him the diploma, the same gesture he had repeated countless times, yet this one felt different, as if it carried more than paper and ink. As Marcus turned to face the audience, a ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, not into celebration alone, but into acknowledgement. Evelyn watched from where she stood, not at the center now, but not on the outside either. She had not reclaimed a place. She had revealed it had always been hers. One by one, the ceremony resumed, names called, hands shaken, applause given. But the rhythm was no longer automatic. It was intentional, thoughtful, changed. And through it all, the earlier moment did not fade. It remained, quiet but present, shaping the way every person in that room now saw what was unfolding before them. Because sometimes, the most powerful shift does not come from what is added, but from what is finally understood. And that understanding, once seen, does not leave. It stays in the silence between words, in the space between actions, reminding everyone that respect, once delayed, always arrives carrying weight. The ceremony continued, but it no longer felt like a sequence of names and applause. It felt like a series of moments being witnessed more carefully than before. Each student who walked across the stage now carried more than their own achievement. They carried the quiet awareness that something meaningful had shifted in the room they were about to leave behind. Principal Daniel Brooks called each name with steady rhythm, but there was a difference in the way he looked at them now, a pause that had not existed earlier, a recognition that extended beyond the script in his hands. The audience responded differently as well, their applause no longer automatic, but intentional, as if each clap acknowledged not only success, but the effort and dignity behind it. Evelyn Carter stepped away from the center of the stage and moved to the side, choosing not to reclaim the spotlight that had found her. She stood near the edge, her posture relaxed, her presence quiet once again, yet nothing about her felt invisible anymore. People noticed her now, not because she demanded attention, but because they understood what they had missed before. A few parents exchanged glances, subtle, thoughtful, as if replaying the earlier moment in their minds, reconsidering what they had seen and what they had assumed. Some students looked toward her as they walked back to their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to respect, even if they could not fully explain why. Marcus returned to his place among his classmates, his diploma resting lightly in his hands, but his attention still drawn toward his mother. There was no need for words between them. The moment had already spoken enough. On stage, Brooks reached the final names on his list, his voice steady, but quieter now, not in volume, but in tone, as though each word carried more weight than before. When the last student crossed the stage, a collective pause settled over the auditorium, the kind that usually signals the end of an event, but this time, it felt like something else, something unfinished in a way that invited reflection rather than conclusion. Brooks looked out over the audience once more, his eyes no longer scanning for order, but acknowledging presence. "Congratulations to the graduating class," he said, his voice clear, but softened by everything that had come before. "Today marks the beginning of what you choose to carry forward." He paused, just briefly, then added, "Not just your achievements, but your awareness." The words lingered, not dramatic, not rehearsed, but real. As the audience rose to their feet, applause filled the room once again, but it did not feel like the same applause that had opened the ceremony. This one was fuller, more grounded, as if it recognized something beyond celebration. Evelyn remained still at the side of the stage, watching quietly as families stood, as cameras lifted, as students smiled, as the room slowly returned to motion. But even in that movement, something remained unchanged. The silence from earlier had not disappeared. It had transformed. It now lived beneath the noise, beneath the applause, beneath the conversations that would follow. It was no longer a pause. It was a memory forming in real time. As people began to move toward the exits, conversations started in low voices, not loud or chaotic, but thoughtful, measured, as if each person was carrying something they had not expected to take with them. A teacher paused near the aisle, looking toward Evelyn, her expression no longer distant, but reflective. A parent gently lowered their phone, no longer focused on capturing moments, but on understanding them. Marcus stood slowly, turning once more toward his mother, and this time, there was a faint smile, not wide, not dramatic, but certain. Evelyn met his gaze and returned it, equally subtle, equally steady. No words, no gestures, just understanding. The lights above the stage remained bright, illuminating the space where everything had unfolded, but what had changed could not be captured by light alone. It existed in the way people walked differently, looked differently, thought differently as they made their way out. And as the auditorium doors opened once again, letting the evening air flow back in, the room did not return to what it had been, because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And in that quiet, lasting shift, the meaning of the day extended far beyond graduation. It became something else entirely, something that would stay. The crowd slowly spilled out of the auditorium into the cooling evening air, but the energy that followed them was not loud or celebratory in the usual way. It was quieter, more thoughtful, as if each person carried something invisible that could not be left behind with the folding chairs and stage lights. Conversations happened in softer tones, pauses lasting longer than usual, eyes meeting and then looking away again with a new kind of awareness. Evelyn Carter stepped down from the side of the stage after most had begun to leave, her movements unhurried, her presence returning to the quiet rhythm she had always carried. She walked toward the exit without seeking attention, yet the path ahead of her opened naturally, people stepping aside not out of obligation, but out of respect they had only just learned how to give. Outside, the sky had shifted into a deep shade of blue, the last traces of sunlight fading behind the school buildings as families gathered in small circles across the parking lot. Marcus stood near the base of the steps, his graduation cap now in his hand, his gown slightly creased from the long afternoon, but his posture steady. When he saw his mother emerge, he did not rush toward her, he simply waited, allowing the distance between them to close at its own pace. When Evelyn reached him, they stood facing each other for a moment, neither speaking, both understanding that what had happened inside could not be reduced to a simple exchange of words. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice low, respectful, but certain. "You knew this would happen," he said. It was not a question. Evelyn looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady as always. "I knew something would," she replied, "but not exactly how." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, recognizing the difference between expectation and control. Around them, other families embraced, laughter rising in small bursts, cameras flashing again as if trying to reclaim the lightness of the day. But even in those moments, something remained altered, something that would not return to what it had been before. A few parents glanced toward Evelyn, their expressions carrying a mix of curiosity and quiet respect, as if they wanted to say something, but understood that words might not be enough. From the entrance, Principal Daniel Brooks stepped outside as well, his tie slightly loosened now, his posture no longer rigid, but reflective. He paused at the top of the steps, scanning the parking lot until his eyes found Evelyn. For a moment, he remained where he was, as if weighing whether to approach or to let the moment pass. Then, with measured steps, he made his way down. Marcus noticed him first, his body shifting slightly, not in defense, but in awareness. Evelyn remained still. Brooks stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance that had not existed earlier that day. The silence between them was not tense. It was deliberate. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice no longer carrying authority, but sincerity. "I have spent years believing that structure protects people." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Today, I realized it can also overlook them." Evelyn listened, her expression unchanged, her attention complete. Brooks continued, "I cannot undo what happened, but I can learn from it." He did not extend his hand. He did not offer anything rehearsed. Just truth, simple and late. Evelyn gave a small nod, not as approval, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. That is where it begins, she said quietly. The words were neither heavy nor light, but they stayed. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, then stepped back, understanding that the conversation did not need to continue. Some things, once spoken honestly, do not require more. He turned and walked away, not as the man who had controlled the ceremony, but as someone who had been changed by it. Marcus exhaled slowly, something in his shoulders releasing as he looked back at his mother. You did not need to prove anything, he said. Evelyn glanced toward the building, then back at him. No, she replied softly. But sometimes the truth needs to be seen. They stood there together as the evening settled fully, the sounds of celebration continuing around them, yet somehow distant. The lights from the auditorium still glowed faintly behind them, but what had happened inside no longer belonged to that space. It had moved beyond it, into the people who had witnessed it, into the choices they would make after, into the way they would see the next person who did not seem to belong. And as the last of the crowd began to disperse, leaving the parking lot quieter than before, one thing remained clear, not spoken, not announced, but understood. That day was never just about graduation. It was about recognition. And in the end, the loudest lesson was not delivered through applause or authority, but through the kind of silence that changes how people see the world.